Stop. Don't scroll any further. What you're about to hear is a slap in the face of the entire beauty industry. We've been taught to believe that Hollywood is a sanctuary of perfection, a place where every inch of skin is measured with a ruler. But you have no idea how many legends whose portraits are now worshipped as ideals were once called ugly creatures, ridiculous monkeys, freaks of nature by studio executives. They said it to their faces. Nobody wanted them. Producers slammed doors shut, advising them to go work in a factory or join a freak show. Watch until the end to see how those deemed too ugly for the screen destroyed their tormentors and became icons the world now kneels before. The final story, about a woman whose face was labeled a catastrophe, will force you to rethink the very meaning of beauty. But before we begin with the first star, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show. Marilyn Monroe. Prepare for your world to turn upside down. The woman who is now a global symbol of femininity, whose image is reproduced on billions of posters, and whose name has become synonymous with beauty, began her Hollywood journey as unsellable merchandise. If you think Norma Jean was welcomed with open arms, you couldn't be more wrong. To the executives at 20th Century Fox and Columbia Pictures, she wasn't just not their type, they considered her outright ugly, awkward, and cheap-looking. After her first screen tests, her personal files carried humiliating notes: not photogenic, face lacks grace, painfully ordinary appearance. When Norma Jean Mortensen first stepped into the offices of powerful producers, they laughed in her face. A casting director at Fox once told her bluntly, "Sweetheart, take a look at yourself. Your jaw is too heavy, your teeth are crooked, and your nose looks like a potato. You are too ugly for the movies." They openly told her her looks were a disaster for the camera. Hollywood at the time demanded refined aristocrats with delicate features, and Norma seemed like a coarse country girl. Producers whispered behind her back, "Nobody wants them," meaning girls like her, background nobodies trying to leap beyond their station. She was considered ugly by studio standards because of her natural type. She lacked the fatal mystery they sought in actresses. One of the bosses at Columbia Pictures, Harry Cohn, refused to even remember her name, calling her "that fat girl with the wide face." She was told her smile looked stupid and her eyes were empty. Columbia terminated her contract after just 6 months, stating that she had no talent and that her face couldn't hold an audience's attention even in a minor role. To them, she was used-up material, not even worth the cost of makeup. It was a time of total humiliation. Norma Jean heard the word no more often than her own name. She was advised to become a waitress or a secretary in some dingy office because the screen would never love her. To prove them wrong, she had to pass through a real surgical and psychological hell. To erase the label of ugly, Monroe underwent a nose job to make it more refined and had a chin implant to soften the heavy jaw that so enraged producers. She dyed her brown hair platinum blonde because studios considered her natural color dirty and tasteless. But even then, Hollywood continued to persecute her. She was told she was too vulgar, that her body was disproportionate and offensive to decent audiences. Her breathy manner of speaking was mocked as a speech defect, though in reality it was her way of fighting a stutter. Ugly inside and out, those might as well have been the headlines attached to her early auditions. She was an outsider, a woman no one believed in, a casting mistake. The tragedy was that Monroe began to believe in her own ugliness. Even after becoming a global star, she spent her life searching the mirror for that ugly Norma Jean who had once been thrown out of a producer's office. The very people who screamed nobody wanted them later made billions off her, yet never apologized for trying to destroy her identity at the very beginning. They created the myth of Marilyn only after killing her confidence in her own worth.
Marilyn Monroe became the first and loudest proof that the so-called experts in Hollywood offices are often blind sadists, incapable of recognizing a future icon beneath small imperfections. She shattered their standards and forced the world to worship a face once dismissed as ordinary. But the price of that victory was devastating. She proved she was beautiful, yet never truly believed it herself.
Clint Eastwood. In 1954, Clint Eastwood, a Korean War veteran and former lifeguard, walked into Universal Studios for an audition. He was young, hopeful, and confident. What he heard from the professional casting executives that day could have killed his desire to ever stand in front of a camera again. The studio producers delivered a verdict that sounds absurd today. Clint Eastwood was deemed ugly by studio standards because of his physical proportions. The first thing that infuriated the bosses was his height. 193 centimeters of solid muscle struck them as ridiculous. They told him outright, "You're too tall. You look like a crane on screen. Any actress next to you will look like a dwarf. It's unattractive. It ruins the composition." Hollywood at the time favored compact leading men, and Eastwood simply did not fit into those narrow frames. But that was only the beginning. The real humiliation started when they moved on to a detailed examination of his face. The producers literally pointed at his neck. "Look at his Adam's apple," they shouted. "It's enormous. It moves up and down when he talks and distracts the audience from the story. It looks unhealthy and ugly." Yes, you heard that right. One of the most recognizable profiles and jawlines in cinema history was once considered a defect. They told him his face was too bony, lacked softness, and looked like a skull stretched tight with skin. But the final blow was his teeth. In those years, Hollywood demanded perfectly straight, blindingly white smiles, even if they didn't yet call them veneers. Eastwood had a small chip in one of his front teeth. For Universal, that was a sentence. They told him directly, "You have crooked teeth and a strange way of speaking through them. You'll never play romantic leads. No one will want to kiss that mouth. Your diction is terrible." The manner of speech that would later become his trademark, the famous squint and gravelly whisper, was labeled in 1954 as an inability to pronounce words clearly due to a deformed jaw. Studio reports from that era repeated the same phrase over and over: no one wanted him. Eastwood was described as wooden, too rough and unphotogenic. He was advised to go work construction or return to the army because a face like that might scare children in movie theaters. In the end, Universal terminated his contract without giving him a single serious role. He was shown the door as a failed experiment. Eastwood didn't break. He went to Europe to work with a then unknown director named Sergio Leone and starred in the Dollars trilogy. There, in the dust of the Spanish plains, it turned out that his oversized Adam's apple, his chipped teeth, and his bony face were exactly the right look for a new kind of hero. He proved that masculine beauty is not about prettiness, but about inner strength. When he returned to Hollywood in triumph, the same producers who once called him ugly were the first to run toward him with checkbooks in hand. But Clint never forgot their words. His story is a slap in the face to every so-called beauty expert. Clint Eastwood showed that what the crowd calls your flaws can become your greatest advantage if you have the courage to resist studio bullying. He became an icon by being too ugly for people who understood nothing about real cinema.
Audrey Hepburn. The woman who is now considered the ultimate embodiment of aristocratic elegance, whose face adorns millions of souvenirs around the world, was once Hollywood's greatest outsider. In the early 1950s, when she first appeared before the studio power brokers, she was met not with applause, but with icy contempt. In an era ruled by the lush, hypersexual curves of Marilyn Monroe, Jane Russell, and Elizabeth Taylor, Audrey Hepburn was dismissed as a freak of nature. Producers who measured an actress's worth by the size of her hips and breasts openly called Audrey ugly and sickly. When she arrived for her first auditions at Paramount, laughter echoed through the corridors. Casting directors, those self-proclaimed gods of beauty, delivered verdicts one after another. She looks like a skeleton wrapped in skin. That's not a woman, that's a teenage boy who survived typhus. For an industry built on abundance and juicy images, Audrey Hepburn was too ugly for the big screen. Her body, emaciated by years of Nazi occupation and starvation, provoked irritation rather than sympathy among producers. They labeled her thinness anti-sexual and repulsive. In studio files of that period, the same phrase kept appearing, "Nobody wants them," meaning no normal man would ever pay to sit in a theater and look at this bony misunderstanding. The pressure was monstrous. Paramount, having signed her out of sheer desperation, began systematically correcting her ugliness. Producers were horrified by her lack of breasts. On the sets of her early films, costume designers received secret instructions: stuff her bra with cotton, add padding, create the illusion of flesh. They were ashamed to show her on camera as she was. Audrey felt like a circus freak being disguised as a normal human being. She was forced to wear clothes that hid her collarbones, the very collarbones that would later become symbols of elegance, but were then dismissed as the protruding bones of a starving child. Hollywood didn't stop at her figure. Casting experts examined her face under a metaphorical microscope, finding flaws in every millimeter. Her famous thick eyebrows were called wild thickets that made her look masculine and ugly by studio standards. Producers demanded she pluck them into a thin, barely visible line like every beauty of that era. Her nose was deemed too large for such a small face, her teeth crooked and imperfect. Even her neck, now compared to a swan's, was described as frighteningly long, like that of a startled deer. She was taught to believe she was nothing more than a collection of physical defects that had somehow wandered into the camera's frame. Audrey Hepburn lived in an atmosphere of total rejection. They told her to her face, "You have no chance of becoming a top-tier star. You're too specific. You're not beautiful in the classical sense." But inside that fragile young woman lived a will of steel. She did something unthinkable for that time. She refused to break herself. Audrey stopped stuffing her bra with cotton. She refused to pluck her wild eyebrows or hide her sharp cheekbones. She defiantly told Hollywood, "This is who I am. Take it or leave it." When Roman Holiday was released, a tectonic shift occurred. Audiences, exhausted by identical sex bombs, suddenly saw something divine in Audrey's so-called ugly thinness. Her fragility proved stronger than vulgarity. It turned out that enormous eyes and a sincere smile mattered more than the size of a bust. The very producers who called her an orphaned boy began rewriting the rules of beauty the day after the premiere. Audrey Hepburn didn't just win, she destroyed the dictatorship of a single body type. She created the Audrey style, forcing millions of women around the world to stop being ashamed of their thinness and small breasts. She proved that when Hollywood calls you ugly, it is simply signing its own blindness. Audrey Hepburn became an icon, not thanks to studio bosses, but in spite of them. She walked through hell as she was told that nobody wanted her, only to become the woman the entire world desired. She stayed true to her so-called flaws, and they made her immortal, while the names of her critics have long since turned to dust.
Fred Astaire. We are used to seeing him as the embodiment of divine lightness, aristocratic grace, and impeccable style. Fred Astaire is the man in Tales who made the camera dance. But in 1933, when this Broadway upstart first walked into RKO Studios for a screen test, the executives saw not a genius, but a balding misunderstanding with a rodent's face. What happened in those offices is now considered legend, but at the time it was a cruel and cynical act of public humiliation.
He was told to his face that he was too ugly for audiences to ever love him. In an era when Hollywood was obsessed with postcard faces, symmetrical beauties with thick hair and strong jaws, Fred Astaire looked like a frustrating mistake to producers. He had delicate features, a high, already thinning forehead, large ears, and an unusual way of carrying himself. The casting director's verdict was merciless, ugly by studio standards for any romantic or heroic role. One top executive, watching Astaire's screen test, angrily slammed a pencil onto the desk and shouted, "Why did you bring me this waiter? He has the face of a frightened ferret. No sane woman would ever want him to kiss her on screen. The audience will die laughing." The legendary report from his first audition, now a monument to human blindness, read exactly as follows: "Can't act, slightly bald, dances a little." In those 5 words was concentrated all the hatred and narrow-mindedness of the system. Hollywood's butchers deemed his appearance unacceptable. He was called awkward, prematurely old-looking, and completely devoid of sex appeal. In the corridors of RKO, where destinies were decided, whispers followed him. No one wanted him. They said this about actors whose looks they considered defective and painfully ordinary. Studio experts picked his face apart millimeter by millimeter, finding flaws everywhere. His ears were dubbed radar dishes that would distract from the story. His jaw was declared too narrow, his lips too thin for a real man. He was openly advised to forget about a film career and return to the Broadway stage, where, in the half-dark of the theater and under poor lighting, his shortcomings would not be so noticeable. Producers were convinced that a balding man with the looks of a minor clerk could never hold an audience's attention for more than 10 minutes. To them, he was defective merchandise, fit only for the background. But Fred Astaire possessed a secret weapon these people could not measure with their primitive templates: absolute, perfect elegance and a will of steel. He knew perfectly well that he was not handsome by Hollywood standards, but instead of running to surgeons or wearing ridiculous wigs, he chose style. Fred turned his ugliness into high art. He put on a flawlessly tailored tailcoat that emphasized his lines, armed himself with a cane and a top hat to conceal his thinning hair, and began to dance as if gravity simply did not apply to him. When Flying Down to Rio was released, the industry experienced a tectonic shift. It turned out that charisma, impeccable taste, and genius-level skill could be 1,000,000 times more attractive than the most perfect face. The very women the producers had been so concerned about began to fall madly in love with him. His thinness, once called sickly and ugly, became the standard of masculine elegance. Every movement he made on screen was an answer to the small-minded men who had mocked his ears and his forehead. Astaire forced Hollywood to play by his rules. He was the first to firmly demand that dance numbers be filmed in wide shots without cutting, so the audience could see real mastery rather than camera tricks. The same bosses who once called him a balding ferret later stood in line just to shake his hand. He proved that true beauty is not symmetry of features, but the magic of talent and confidence in one's uniqueness. Fred Astaire lived a great life, becoming a legend and the king of dance. He left behind dozens of masterpieces and proved to everyone who was ever told "you're ugly" that the opinions of experts are worth less than the dust on his tap shoes. He became the symbol of an entire era after being rejected by the system, and until his final days remained the most elegant man in any room, while the names of those who called him ugly dissolved forever into oblivion.
Barbra Streisand. Prepare yourself for the most ferocious and thunderous victory of talent over Hollywood's fascism of beauty. Today, we take it for granted that Barbra Streisand is a living legend, a woman who holds every major award imaginable, from Oscars to Emmys, whose name is engraved in gold in the history of music and cinema.
But in the early 1960s, her appearance in casting offices triggered something close to physical disgust among studio bosses. To them, she was not a future icon, but a visual defect, a misunderstanding that had wandered by mistake into the territory of beautiful people. They told her straight to her face, without softening a single word, that she was too ugly for audiences to look at for 2 hours without turning away from the screen. When Barbra, a tough girl from poor Brooklyn with the temperament of a fighting dog, first appeared before agents, they didn't merely doubt her chances, they were appalled by her audacity. In an era when Hollywood demanded tiny button noses, perfectly symmetrical faces, and doll-like eyes, Barbra's appearance was deemed catastrophic and ugly by studio standards. Producers froze in visible discomfort at the sight of her profile. One influential agent of the time glanced at her photo, tossed it aside, and said, "You're talented, sweetheart, but with a face like that, you'll never survive the camera. It hates you. Do the industry a favor. Go under the knife before we throw you in the trash." The primary target of hatred and mockery was her nose. Hollywood butchers from casting departments issued brutal ultimatums. Either you get a nose job and cut off that Jewish schnoz, or you will never get even a bit part. Audiences want to dream, not stare at your anthropological features. She was taught that her appearance was a sentence with no right of appeal. In studio corridors, where open anti-Semitism and worship of rigid standards thrived, people whispered behind her back, "Nobody wants them," meaning actresses whose faces did not fit the polished templates of wasp beauty. They told her her eyes were crossed and set too close together, that her mouth was too large, that her jaw was heavy and ugly. She heard it for years. Anyone else would have surrendered long ago, gone under the surgeon's knife, and turned into another standardized doll with an empty gaze. But Barbra Streisand was made of different material. She possessed an iron core and an almost sacred belief in herself. She flatly refused to change a single millimeter of her face. "My nose is my identity. It's the history of my people and my bloodline. If I cut it off, I'll become just like all of you, a hollow place." That was her answer to their demands for improvement. Hollywood kept mocking her. When she came to audition for Funny Girl, cameramen ran around the set in panic, shouting, "How do we shoot her? No angle works. That nose takes up half the screen." Producers at Columbia demanded she be replaced with someone more conventional. They considered her appearance an insult to the public's sense of aesthetics. But the moment Barbra stepped to the center of the stage and began to sing, the space around her seemed to bend. It turned out that charisma on that scale could transform any supposed flaw into a supreme virtue. She sang in a way that cameramen forgot to press buttons and producers forgot to close their mouths. The release of Funny Girl in 1968 became a funeral march for old Hollywood standards. Barbra didn't just win an Oscar for her debut role, she made the entire planet fall in love with her wrong profile. Yesterday's critics, who had called her an ugly Jewish girl from the outskirts, suddenly choked on praise, describing her beauty as otherworldly, neoclassical, almost biblical. Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, magazines that would never have let her near a cover before, began to fight for the right to photograph her as the symbol of a new era. She proved that when you carry a divine spark and a will of steel, the world will bend to your unique geometry. Barbra Streisand crushed the system completely, leaving her opponents with nothing. She became the first woman in Hollywood to wield such power, becoming a director, a producer, and the master of her own fate. She showed every so-called ugly girl in the world that a nose is not a source of shame, but a symbol of triumph. Those insignificant producers who issued her ultimatums have long since rotted into obscurity, while Barbra's face remains etched into eternity as a symbol of victory over mediocrity and conformity. She was too ugly for their small, limited minds, and far too great for their narrow, suffocating screens.
Sophia Loren. When Sophia Loren first stepped in front of a camera, cinematographers and lighting technicians recoiled in horror, dropping their equipment. They had no idea how to approach her face. At the time, the standard was petite, doll-like beauty, and Sophia burst into the studio like a force of nature, tall, broad-shouldered, with a wild gaze and a face that fit no existing mold. The professional's verdict was merciless. Ugly by studio standards due to a complete lack of proportional harmony. Producers and cameramen literally surrounded her, dissecting her face as if she were a defective mannequin. "Her nose is too long," they shouted. "It casts a shadow across her entire face. And her mouth? It takes up half her face. It looks vulgar." She was made to believe her appearance was a collection of mistakes. One influential cinematographer of the time said bluntly to Carlo Ponti, "Carlo, why did you bring this girl here? She's impossible to shoot. Her jaw looks like an excavator, and her nose has a life of its own. She's too ugly for the big screen." In the corridors of Rome and Hollywood, the familiar phrase echoed again. No one wanted them. They meant girls like her, rough, unpolished girls from poor neighborhoods who supposedly didn't know how to hold their face. The pressure on Sophia was enormous. Producers, including her future husband Carlo Ponti, spoke with one voice. "Sophia, if you want to act, you need surgery. We have to shorten that nose and somehow narrow the mouth. You must look French or American, not like a peasant girl from Naples." Ultimatums were issued. She was threatened with obscurity. She was told she would never play a leading lady as long as her face remained so aggressive and wrong. But this was where the Neapolitan spirit that would later conquer the world revealed itself. Sophia Loren, who had nothing behind her but poverty and hunger, found the strength to say no to the entire industry. "My nose is who I am. My mouth is my voice. I'm not going to cut my face to please your lights." That was her answer. She chose to risk her career rather than become another copy of standardized beauty. Where others saw reasons for a scalpel, she saw her power. Her victory was devastating. Instead of adapting to the camera, she forced the camera to adapt to her. Sophia learned to move and look into the lens in such a way that her too long nose became the ideal profile and her too wide mouth a symbol of overwhelming sensuality. When she stepped onto the world stage, yesterday's critics suddenly went blind from her beauty. It turned out that the very features they called ugly were what made her alive, real, and intouchable. Sophia Loren didn't just become a star, she became an icon whose image outlived decades. She proved to the world that beauty is not the absence of flaws, but the harmony of individuality. Those who called her an awkward Italian girl disappeared into the abyss of history, while Sophia remained standing, majestic, with that same long nose and that same wide mouth that made her the most desired woman on the planet. She defeated the system simply by refusing to fit into it and became a goddess to millions who had also been told they were too ugly.
Humphrey Bogart. Today, his name is synonymous with Iron Will, Casablanca, and the image of the tough guy every man wants to be. But in 1930s Hollywood, Bogart was considered visual trash. Studio bosses looked at him and saw not a romantic lead, but an ugly man with a hangman's face, someone who belonged, at best, in a gutter, and at worst, in the electric chair of a cheap crime flick. They said it to his face, with cynical smirks, that he was too ugly for the public to ever love. When Humphrey Bogart was just starting out in film, he ran headfirst into an industry obsessed with porcelain boys, perfect smiles, dimples, polished charm. Bogart, with his harsh face that looked as if it had been hacked out of stone with a blunt axe, and his perpetually tired, heavy gaze, inspired nothing but irritated disgust among casting directors at Warner Bros. The verdict was swift and merciless. Ugly by studio standards due to a complete lack of classical beauty and a criminal-looking expression. The main target of ridicule was his famous scar on the upper lip. After a serious injury during his naval service, Bogart was left not only with a visible mark, but with a so-called defect, partial paralysis of his upper lip. Because of it, he spoke with a slight lisp through clenched teeth, barely opening his mouth. For Golden Age producers, this was a death sentence. "He's got a paralyzed mouth," they shouted in meetings. "He can't deliver a single line clearly, and that scar looks like a dirty, festering stain on screen. That's physical deformity." They drilled into him that his face was a wall he would never break through. In studio corridors where the fates of millions were decided, the same humiliating phrase echoed, "Nobody wants them," referring to actors whose appearance triggered unease and discomfort rather than a desire to buy a ticket. For years, Bogart was kept on a short leash, cast as third-rate gangsters, goons, and revolting scum. Producer Jack Warner, infamous for his cruelty, openly mocked him. "Humphrey, look at yourself in the mirror. You're downright ugly. Your face exists for one purpose only, to get beaten on screen for 5 minutes and then shot in an alley. You will never, do you hear me, never get a leading role, because no woman on earth wants to be pulled into a final embrace by you." Day after day, he was told he was too ugly for the movies, that his face was cold, dead, and repulsive, that his way of speaking was an irritating hiss. He was advised not to dream of fame and to be grateful he was allowed on set at all, even only to play a corpse or a nameless killer. But that very ugly defect, the scar, the immobile lip, the rigid, restrained expression, became his greatest weapon. In the era of the Great Depression and the looming global catastrophe, audiences no longer wanted saccharine pretty boys who smelled of powder. They needed someone who knew the taste of blood, sweat, and disappointment. Bogart embodied a man who had been through hell, lost everything, and still preserved a shred of honor. His ugly face turned out to be the most honest, the most real face in all fake Hollywood. When Casablanca was released, the industry experienced a nuclear explosion. The world suddenly realized that a scar on the lip could be 1,000 times sexier than a Hollywood smile, and that Bogart's tired, pain-filled eyes spoke of love more powerfully than miles of pompous dialogue. Women on both sides of the ocean went mad for this ugly man. His habit of speaking through clenched teeth instantly became the gold standard of masculinity and coolness, copied by millions of teenagers. Bogart proved to humanity that male beauty is not smooth skin or perfect teeth, but scars, experience, and a character that cannot be faked. He single-handedly defeated a system that spent 10 years trying to lock him into eternal second-rate villain roles. Humphrey Bogart became the highest-paid actor of his era and an absolute legend whose noir style remains an unmatched pinnacle of cinema. The very bosses who once called him a hangman and a paralytic later stood in line for years begging him to sign contracts on any terms, no matter how insane. He proved that a face nobody wanted can become the face of an entire generation and a symbol of eternity. Bogart entered history with his scar and his legendary squint intact, while the perfect pretty boys of his time faded away long ago, dissolving into faceless gray dust.
Bette Davis. In the early 1930s, Hollywood was a factory for producing platinum blondes and languid beauties with flawless faces. Bette Davis, with her sharp features, thin lips, and enormous, slightly bulging eyes, didn't just fail to fit that standard, she frightened it. The producers at Universal Studios handed down a verdict meant to destroy any woman. Ugly, by studio standards, due to a complete lack of sexuality. They said it straight to her face. "Bet there isn't a single thing about you that makes men buy movie tickets. You look like a Sunday school teacher who's just had her purse stolen. You're too ugly for the movies, sweetheart. You've got fish eyes and a face the camera simply refuses to love." In the studio corridors, the same poisonous phrase echoed. No one wanted them. That was how the bosses referred to actresses whose talent outweighed their bust size. Producers saw her appearance as a misunderstanding, something impossible to sell. The mockery of her looks was systematic. In an effort to turn her into a normal actress, studio stylists resorted to barbaric measures. They bleached her hair until it resembled straw, layered on tons of makeup to smother her distinctive features, and forced her into ridiculous costumes with massive shoulder pads to somehow balance her face. One cinematographer seriously suggested lighting her only from behind because her eyes reflected too much light and looked frightening. She was taught to believe she was nothing more than a collection of physical flaws to be hidden, not shown. But Bette Davis was not called Warner Brothers' fourth Oscar for nothing, the studio she fled to after escaping Universal. She had a ferocious temperament. "If all you want from me is a pretty face, go to hell. I'm an actress, not a mannequin," she shouted at producers. She turned her so-called ugly, fish-like eyes into her greatest weapon. She learned to use them so powerfully that audiences forgot how to breathe. Those same eyes that Carl Laemmle once called frightening became legendary. Decades later, they would inspire the worldwide hit Bette Davis Eyes. Bette staged a revolution. She became the first actress unafraid to look ugly on screen if the role demanded it. In Of Human Bondage, she appeared as a degraded, sickly waitress, without makeup, with greasy hair and deathly pale skin. Hollywood was stunned. None of the reigning beauties of the era would have dared such a thing, but it was this role that made her great. She proved that true magnetism is born from pain, rage, and truth, not from perfect teeth. She defeated the system that tried to break her. Bette Davis became the first woman to serve as president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and the first actress in history to receive 10 Academy Award nominations. The bosses who once failed to recognize her at a train station later were grateful just to stand in the shadow of her greatness. She proved to the world that when Hollywood tells you you're too ugly, it really means you're too real for a city built on fake smiles. She remains eternal as the queen of Warner Brothers, and her ugly eyes still look out at us from the screen, reminding us of the triumph of spirit over stereotype. Gary Cooper. When Gary Cooper first appeared at the doors of casting offices, Hollywood was obsessed with Latin lovers and elegant dancers. Cooper, towering nearly 2 meters tall with enormous hands and a perpetually shy, uncertain gaze, struck studio bosses as ugly by studio standards because of his glaring awkwardness. They called him a wooden statue, insisting that the cameras simply didn't know what to do with a giant like that. Producers at Paramount openly mocked his appearance. "Look at the way he walks. He moves like a paralyzed grasshopper." They shouted this during auditions, telling him straight to his face that he was too ugly for the movies because his face was too empty, too farmer-like. They claimed he had no charisma at all, and his shyness was labeled a lack of intelligence written all over his face. Casting reports from those years repeated the same merciless verdict: nobody wants them, referring to actors who looked too rough and too plain for a polished screen. For years, Cooper was kept in silent roles as a stuntman or extra, often not even allowed to show his face. He was taught that his ugliness was his height and his quiet nature. Studio stylists tried to fix him. They forced him into clothes meant to visually reduce his height, caked his face with makeup to hide what they called his weather-beaten skin, and constantly demanded that he stop slouching. One director told him with complete seriousness, "Gary, you're too big. You don't fit in the frame with normal people. Go back to your farm and your cows. Your size won't annoy anyone there." But Gary Cooper possessed something these cynical dealers could not comprehend. He was real. He didn't try to act handsome. He simply existed on screen. And when the film Barbara Worth was released in 1926, where he had only a small role, something unbelievable happened. Audiences, especially women, went mad. His so-called wooden restraint turned out to be raw magnetism, and his awkward hike became a symbol of strength and reliability. The face once dismissed as empty suddenly became, for millions of women, the most desirable face in the world. Cooper sparked a revolution by creating the image of the strong, silent American hero.
He proved that a man doesn't need to preen or flex his muscles to be attractive. The very traits studios had called ugly, his shyness, his huge hands, his slow, measured speech, became his signature style. Over the course of his career, he won 2 Academy Awards and became one of the highest-paid actors in history. He defeated a system that tried to push him out for failing to meet its standards. Gary Cooper showed that true masculinity and beauty are not about swagger or pretty looks, but about sincerity and quiet confidence. The same bosses who once told him to shovel manure fed off his films for decades afterwards, while Gary Cooper remained in the memory of generations as the ideal man, one before whom even Ernest Hemingway himself bowed his head.
Ava Gardner. Prepare yourself for the final chord of our investigation, one that makes you shudder at just how blind and cruel the so-called professional eye can be. We end this list with a woman whose name is now synonymous with overwhelming, almost divine beauty. Ava Gardner. The woman who would later be called the most beautiful animal in the world, whose portraits drove men mad and sent women running to mirrors in search of even a shadow of her grace. And yet, at the very beginning of her journey, mighty Hollywood passed a verdict that sounded like a death sentence. Physically and intellectually unfit for the screen. Producers looked at her and saw not a future goddess, but an awkward, ugly country girl with a wild accent, someone meant for a tobacco field, not the glare of studio lights. In 1941, young Ava Gardner, the daughter of a poor farmer from North Carolina, accidentally ended up auditioning at MGM. One would think her extraordinary beauty would have blinded everyone in the room and forced producers to sign her on the spot. But Hollywood was so imprisoned by artificial standards and class arrogance that it greeted her with icy, annihilating contempt. Louis B. Mayer, the all-powerful head of MGM, a man who decided with a raised eyebrow who would be a god and who would be nothing, flew into a rage after watching Ava's first screen test. He stormed out of the projection room, flinging papers and shouting at his assistants. "Why did you bring me this? She can't act, she can't walk, she can't talk. She's terrible." To Mayer and his polished inner circle, Ava Gardner was ugly by studio standards because of her raw, primal roughness. She did not resemble their refined ladies with flawless manners. She was labeled too coarse, too wild, and utterly lacking any sign of intelligence in her face. Producers openly mocked her heavy Southern accent, claiming her voice sounded like rusty metal scraping against a saw. They told her to her face that she was too ugly in her movements, that she walked bow-legged like a peasant in the fields, and that the camera exposed her primitiveness and lack of breeding. In the hallways of MGM, the same venomous phrase circulated: no one wanted them. They meant provincial girls, girls with pretty faces, but, as they sneered, empty souls and no polish. The humiliation and attempts to fix Ava went on for years. She wasn't merely taught how to act, she was dismantled and rebuilt as if her natural self were defective. She was forced to spend 8 hours a day with speech coaches who practically tortured her, trying to erase her ugly accent. Walking instructors drilled her until her feet bled, insisting that her natural feline grace was cheap vulgarity. One leading cinematographer seriously suggested softening her cheekbones with makeup, calling them too aggressive and masculine, and her gaze disturbingly predatory. Every day she was told that without total reconstruction, she was nothing, just a pretty girl from nowhere who had been mistakenly given a studio pass. But Hollywood made a fatal mistake. They mistook her authentic animal power for a lack of culture. Ava Gardner possessed something that cannot be trained: wild magnetism. She endured 5 years of humiliating, wordless bit parts, used as little more than living scenery.
She tolerated the sneers of executives who called her brainless decoration and an ugly bumpkin. And then, in 1946, The Killers was released, and the world detonated. The moment Ava appeared in screen in a black satin dress, the entire planet seemed to gasp. It turned out that the very wildness Mayer called horrible was the purest and most powerful sexual magnetism cinema had ever known. The cheekbones they wanted to hide instantly became the gold standard for plastic surgeons worldwide. The gaze, once labeled aggressive, became the ultimate symbol of the femme fatale, irresistible and lethal. Ava Gardner proved that true beauty needs no approval from studio tyrants or their fake degrees in aesthetics. She became the woman for whose love the most powerful men on earth fought, from billionaire Howard Hughes to music royalty Frank Sinatra. She defeated the system that spent 5 years trying to turn her into an obedient puppet with a manufactured voice. Ava Gardner remained in history as a true goddess of the screen, while Louis B. Mayer and his army of experts who called her an ugly country girl were reduced to a shameful footnote in her story. She put a definitive end to this list, proving one simple truth. When Hollywood tells you you're terrible, it only means you are far too magnificent for their small, pathetic, and moldy minds.
We have passed through 10 lives broken and rebuilt from the ground up. We have seen how the so-called Dream Factory tried to crush those who are now the pride of world art. Marilyn Monroe, Clint Eastwood, Audrey Hepburn, Humphrey Bogart, Ava Gardner. Every one of them was told the same thing. You're ugly. You're unwanted. You don't belong. Go home. And every one of them answered Hollywood not with words, but with deeds, becoming immortal icons. Write in the comments whose story shocked you the most. Which case of so-called ugliness by studio standards strikes you as the most absurd? Your opinion is the strongest defense against the dictatorship of fake ideals. Like this video if it helped you look at yourself differently in the mirror. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel.